Good morning. So, Micah. How many of you know all kinds of things about the prophet Micah? Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. All right, so we're going to locate ourselves a little bit in the timeline and the history of Israel, because last week we heard Pastor Chad preaching about the prophet Elisha, who was a prophet in the kingdom of the area that we call the northern kingdom of Israel, because Israel did not stay a united kingdom after King Solomon. As King Solomon, while we had that passage a couple of weeks ago about how he asked for this great wisdom, he didn't really use it a whole lot, even though God gave it to him. He so heavily taxed and burdened the people and enslaved them, mistreated many of his people, and when he died, his son took over, and his son decided that he was going to be even worse than his father was, and so the kingdom split in half. Because kingdom of Judah, which was the tribe, of course, of David and Solomon, and then his son Rehoboam, were down in Judah, and pretty much everybody else split off and formed that northern kingdom of Israel. So Pastor Chad had mentioned last week that the king of the northern kingdom of Israel was kind of having a bad day when that Syrian from Aram general came to him, Naaman, looking for some healing. Well, the problem is those kings have a lot of bad days, to the point that they are eventually destroyed by the Assyrian Empire for their basically corruption, their idolatry, their injustice. So they disappear and are destroyed. South, on the other hand, had made a deal with the Assyrians, so they got to stay in power for a little while as a vassal state. Then Hezekiah came along and rebelled against them, and God was with them and preserved them and spared them. But then he had a son that came along and did a lot of really bad things as well, like, child sacrifice. So when Micah steps up, Micah is actually contemporary of the prophet Isaiah. You probably know of him a little bit more. He was the one who was, counseling the kings like Hezekiah. Well, Micah was also prophesying about this time. And so this is the context into which Micah enters the picture. And when Micah makes his statement about what you should offer up to God to make him happy, he of course goes into some kind of hyperbole about, do you think God wants 10,000 rivers of oil? And then he says, does he want your firstborn? Problem is that one isn't hyperbolic. That was actually happening. Manasseh, Hezekiah's son, was actually giving up firstborn children as sacrifice to the god Moloch. So this gives you that context. What society was like, the challenges that Micah saw and was facing in his country. He lived in a world that had run amok morally, socially, religiously. We hear Micah giving a stark warning. Jerusalem is eventually going to fall. Back in chapter 1 of Micah, he warns this. It is going to fall because of its own corruption and its injustices, how it was treating the poor, the foreigner, the vulnerable in its society. That is going to bring about its downfall. He gives that warning, like I said, in chapter 1. For lo, the Lord is coming out of his place and will come down and tread upon the high places of the earth. All this for the transgression of Jacob, for the sins of the house of Israel. And what is the high place of Judah? Is it not Jerusalem? So when he says God's going to come trample those high places, that means Jerusalem. Jerusalem has a limited life expectancy. Gotta love the prophets. They're always so cheery. But what's important to note about the prophet Micah is that despite this warning of Jerusalem's destruction due to its own sin, he offers up some hope. Hope from a very unlikely place, from a little town called Bethlehem. We know the song. And of course, in the past, leadership came out of this town before. It's where King David was from. And of course, King David was an unlikely individual as well to be raised up, a simple shepherd boy who was then to become the shepherd of the people of Israel. He now says that once again, Israel's hope and salvation is going to come from this little unlikely town of Bethlehem. If you remember the sermon from last week, Pastor Chad talked about who moved the story along. It wasn't the generals, it wasn't the kings. Who was it? The servants. That's right. The people you don't expect. Here again, God working through the unexpected, the little things. Not through Jerusalem, the big, strong capital that always flexed its might, but from this little town, this little suburb of Bethlehem. Because God chooses that which is low and despised, that which is not considered strong. So here is Micah. He is in the midst of a massive national upheaval with a society whose destructive behaviors just seem to be unstoppable. And it's so easy to despair in the midst of that kind of situation. I think a lot of us know about that. We can identify with those feelings, how we sometimes feel those daily onslaughts, the negativity that just is constantly barraging us. It becomes easy for us to become very cynical and to let that overshadow our lives. And yet, here is Micah, still offering out that little hope, that hope that will come out of Bethlehem, which of course will be Jesus. But even in the midst of all this corruption and injustice, he is recentering us by reclaiming a promise and pointing how God always works in and through the unexpected, and holding that out as this vision for Israel's future. Yes, Jerusalem will be destroyed, but there is hope. God works in and through the deeply flawed societies that we live in. In fact, this week, Pastor Chad and I were at a conference on ministry up in Leesburg. One of the bishop's assistants is from Palestine. He gave the sermon. It was a very moving story, one I'm going to share with you as well. How as a Palestinian Christian living in Palestine, he was one day picked up by the Israelis for no reason and thrown into prison. He was beaten for 18 days before they finally brought him a change of clothes and a Bible and said, "We will give you this change of clothes and this Bible if you confess to some crime." He refused. His name was Heather. He refused and said no. He would not confess to this crime he did not commit. So he got to stay in jail for a little while longer, had to be beaten a few more times. But while he was there, sitting outside of his cell was another Israeli soldier who was the guard. Heather would occasionally talk to him. And one day, Heather was feeling extremely low. He could see out onto that guard's desk, and he could see chocolates that were sitting there. And so he said, "God, give me a sign you are with me. Give me one of those chocolates. Just give me one of those chocolates." Well, dinner time rolled around. After the Israeli guard had finished his meal, he walked over to the cell door, opened up the little window they could pass things through, and slid that little piece of chocolate through the door. Mother began to cry. And he shared with the Israeli soldier why he was crying, how he had prayed to God to give him a sign. That sign was that piece of chocolate. So the Israeli guard opened the door, sat down, and they talked. That Israeli soldier became a Christian, his entire household, due to that encounter. He was introduced to Christ through this unlikely place, a Palestinian prisoner in his jail. In the midst of this terrible injustice, God worked a miracle through a tiny piece of chocolate. So what does God require from you, O mortal? A bunch of stuff? A bunch of difficult sacrifices? Something that is totally unattainable? No. What God desires of us is within our capacity, within the little things. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. It's a call to be in relationship with one another, to love one another, to listen to one another, to humble yourself enough to listen and hear the other. The tricky part, of course, we stand up here and we say, do justice. Is if I ask each one of you what justice looks like, I'm going to get a whole bunch of different answers. Many of us would even argue over what happened with Qadr. Was it unjust for him to just be picked up simply because he was a Palestinian and thrown into prison and beaten? Or some might argue, well, look at what has happened to the Israelis, and don't they have a right to do what they feel they need to do against their enemies? Different people have different views on what justice means for them. And it's a big part of why we are so divided in this country right now. Because my definition of justice and your definition of justice may not be the same. So this is my challenge to you this week. Go find somebody you disagree with and ask them that question. Not to fight, but just to ask, to humble yourself, to listen. What does justice mean to you? What does that look like in your eyes? Don't roll your eyes when they say they're a Democrat or they're a Republican. Sit down with them. Genuinely engage in a conversation to learn what justice means for that person. Discover what you might have to learn from them instead of shouting over one another. Instead of regurgitating a politician's talking points, dig deep into what justice looks like, what biblical justice looks like. Not just for you, but for the other in your midst, even those you may view as an enemy, even those you may view as a danger. Because that makes us ask, what actually does a just society look like? What is God's view and definition of justice? Because clearly, places like Judah and Israel were not living it out. And we know what happened to them. Unjust societies fall in on themselves. They destroy themselves. how do we heed the prophet's warning? How do we step back from the transgressions that are ruining even our society today? Then maybe, just maybe, at least as Christians, we can come to some kind of agreement on what it means to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. Instead of that destruction that the prophets warn that will come when societies become corrupt and unjust, maybe we can find healing and wholeness and new life. Shocking thing in Christianity to think about new life and resurrection in our communities, in the small places, in pieces of chocolate, in little towns like Bethlehem, in small communities like Palm City, Florida. Let us pray.